of, oh, there you go. Now, a minute, I gotta turn that off. Okay, there we go. And it guides us, our culture guides us in our day-to-day decisions. And it's something that is a cumulative effect that is present at all times. So a lot of people think of culture as just being, song and dance, music, art, that kind of thing. But in fact, it's much more than that. It's a moral compass, and it is reinforced by the things that happen in our society. The kind of games that we play, the kind of interactions that we have in a social setting, the things that are considered normal, the dress, everything that we engage in on a day-to-day basis is shaped by the cultural framework that we live in. And in some ways, I liken it to the water that the fish swim in, right? The culture is the water that we swim in. And so it's very difficult for us to pay attention to that because we take it for granted. This is what we were born in. We were acclimatized to the cultural framework that we exist in from the day that we were born. And we tend to pass it on to our children. The challenge is that, does that cultural framework still have relevance? Most of the cultural norms that we actually have in our lives date back to hundreds, if not thousands of years. They've been repeated over and over again. And they determine what we perceive ourselves to be as possible, what other people see as possible, and of course, what the people that we try to influence, like what is politically possible, right? What is the political will? And so for us to ignore the strong role that our culture plays and just take it for granted and assume that it will sort of come along, I think is ignoring the biggest obstacle to the kind of changes that any kind of transition calls for. So one of the things that happens a lot in our current culture is that and I'm just looking at my notes to make sure that I cover the points I promised to cover. We tend to point the finger when we think of who's in charge. And that's, again, is a cultural norm going way back, thousands of years, that we have a tribal leader, we have a king, we have some kind of a figure, a head of state, and they are deemed to rule in some form. And so our cultural norm is that we can point the finger at them and say, well, the reason that everything is going wrong is because they're not doing the job they're supposed to be doing. And so when it comes to democratic governments, of course, we have maybe a Congress, or we have a House of Commons, and we have a larger body that works with that leader. But still, as citizens, tend to point the finger at them as being the ones that have to make the change. They function within the same cultural framework that we do. And therefore, the overall cultural framework that exists is going to limit their ability to act, even if they want to. And because of political operatives, of course, there is a whole lot more pressure on them to conform to where the culture is currently, rather than breaking out of that culture and proposing something radically new, which could cost them votes. Another part of our culture is what Douglas Adams referred to as the SEP, which is a very interesting cloaking device. When you can assign something or designate something as being somebody else's problem, it tends to disappear off your radar, right? And so there's a lot of things that we can do in terms of ignoring poverty, in terms of ignoring environmental degradation, or right now we're looking at, with COP15, we're looking at loss of biodiversity. If that's somebody else's problem, if it's not something that is in my wheelhouse, I can choose to ignore it. It's fairly easy to ignore it. And while those of us who are in the trenches of moving these things, trying to move these things forward, we forget that the majority of people don't. They're not in the trenches, right? So I always find it interesting when you have 1,000 people or 100 people protesting something. Governments and the political advisors look at that and say, okay, there's what, 13 million people or whatever in a province, and we've got 100 people protesting. Well, that means that 12 million people don't care about this issue, right? So we have to be careful about how we interpret that. And we have to recognize that we are not, those of us who are activists are not in the majority. So the cultural norm that the majority uses to guide its day-to-day decisions and the choices it makes, including how it votes, are going to be the driving force. SEP, somebody else's problem. It's something that is very easy to get things off your plate. And so what is our capacity to inform decision, right? To make informed decisions. We think we are rational people or rational creatures when in fact we're more rationalizing creatures. So the decisions we tend to make are organized and are limited by, again, our culture. We think we can take data and information and logically consume it. And, science and the scientific community encourages that. And we all think of ourselves as modern people. So we think we follow that approach, when in fact, emotion drives behavior. And what we tend to do as humans is we tend to cherry pick the information that supports the decisions we've already made emotionally. And that's just the way we function. We've always functioned that way. And not to be aware of that dynamic means that we continue to push back, which the progressive movement and the environmental movement has done for decades, and see no result, right? Whereas other movements can push emotion and see relatively quick results. So how do we actually bring about the changing decisions of the individual? Well, the individual is driven by emotion, and emotion is driven by community, and community has a much greater influence as to how we deal with an issue, how we move on an issue, than the reasoning or the scientific data or the graph or the chart or the numbers can actually translate into action. So who is our community? When we define the boundaries of our community, traditionally our community has been a very small group of people, whether it's a village or whether it's our family or whether it's a political party or whatever, or a service club. We have a group of people, or a church. We have a group of people that we have a sense of affinity to, and they tend to define who we listen to. They define the capacity, the pressure that informs our decisions, and they also help to create the rules that we live by. Okay, so my father-in-law was a strong Rotarian, and they had certain things that they did as Rotarians, and he could travel anywhere in the world and be welcomed by other Rotarians because everyone knew, no matter where he traveled, that they followed the same sort of cultural norm as Rotarians. So he was comfortable in that community, and it helped to strengthen his sense of self in many ways. The problem is that these kind of definitions of boundaries are relatively restrictive, and they set up an us versus them paradigm. And it's very difficult for us to recognize when we're tramping on other people's rights or other people's freedoms when we live in an us versus them paradigm. And to remove that us versus them paradigm in a global setting, in a global world with global crises, with as Tad calls it, the polycrisis that permeates every corner of this planet, maybe it's time for us to consider that the borders of our tribe should not be a line on the map or a costume or a skin tone or some other human construct, but rather the upper limit of our precious atmosphere. That life within the sphere of this planet should be everything that is within, it should be included within our tribe. And defining the boundary to that scale could have tremendous changes in the way we look at the world, in the breadth of our horizon. So how do we, if we do this, what role does culture, in terms of the traditional concept of culture, art, rituals, costumes, music, etc., play? The traditional role of culture is to reinforce the norms of our society, right? They challenge them in some cases by questioning them, but even in questioning them, they make us think about them, and often what happens is peer pressure causes us to reinforce them. So being aware of the role that the rituals that we have in our world play to reinforce our thinking is another important step. None of this is going to change. We're going to continue to have culture reinforce our rituals. We're going to continue to rely on our community to make our decisions. We're going to continue to follow the same kind of patterns. But by talking about it and creating an awareness, we're engaging in the development of our culture, in the updating of our culture, the upgrading of our culture, much like we would upgrade our approach to healthcare or our transportation, by analyzing what works and what doesn't. Is the culture that we currently have up to the task of helping us embrace the challenges of our time? Or is it providing obstacles? Is it providing a sense of we can't do this because we've never done this. We can't do this because it's going to make so-and-so uncomfortable. We can't do this because this is not the best practices of the past. And one of the last points that's on my list here that I haven't covered yet is one of the things that identifies what our culture is currently is who are our heroes. So when we look at our media and we look at our movies and we look at our stories and so on and so forth, our heroes are full of people who have achieved conquest, who are strong and powerful, who have weaponry, who have we don't tend to celebrate in the heroes of our culture the kind of people that we need in order to build new ideals. And again, that's something that I think we need to work on. We need to look at, be aware of, and recognize just by looking at the heroes that our culture portrays. Is that okay? Are we good with having those kind of models as heroes to us and to our children and to the people that we're asking to make bold new decisions and taking bold new steps to build a better future? I don't know how close I'm into my 20 minutes, but that covers that list.
Brilliant. Like you had 3 more minutes.
Well, there you go. So I would really I'm not very good at making canned presentations. And as you can see, I didn't do a PowerPoint and all that sort of stuff. There's that document that I shared with everyone, which I think goes more into detail to some of these issues, but I really would like to bounce off some of the questions or thoughts that you might have. So please, let's engage.
Beautiful. Thanks, Thomas. I did put the backgrounder in the chat, so you should all have access to that. And Joki, you had a question in the chat, which I think got answered, but I just want to see if you wanted to check in on that or had any other questions.
Not
or
yet.
comments.
Or comments.
Not at this time.
Perhaps I could dive in and just, thanks for all of that, Thomas. Big thinking. And so from the document, it seems like this is a call to action for signing the pledge. Is that right? Is that where you hope this will lead, that we will collectively and individually sign the pledge and encourage others to sign the pledge? Or is there also some other action you're looking for?
Well, I find myself championing the pledge for the reason, sorry, my earbuds are falling out, for the reason that in order to make a culture shift happen, it's one of the things that we can do to change our culture. Is one of the things we can do as individuals right now. Each one of us can decide to make changes in the way we see the world, right? We don't have to wait for governments. We don't have to wait for business. We don't have to wait for somebody else to take the lead. We don't have to lobby anybody to do that. We can just choose to do it ourselves. And one of the things that I've taken from, again, our existing culture is that when we get married or when we graduate from university, we don't do it in isolation. We don't just sort of do it in quiet. I mean, you can get married at the town hall and go with your partner for dinner, and that's it. It's done, right? But that's not what we do, right? We have some kind of a public demonstration of this commitment. And so what I've done with the pledge is I've just given people the opportunity, if they want to say, yes, this whole idea of embracing the need to address our culture is something that I'm willing to dive into. It doesn't change anything I do. It just changes the way I look at the world through a higher awareness. One can sign the pledge and do that. Obviously, you don't have to sign the pledge to embrace this kind of an idea, but it is one of the tools that's available. And so, yes, I've put the website out and the pledge out, and it's nice to have signatories from across the globe, even though they're few in numbers, but we've got signatories, and there's a few of them amongst you. So, yes.
Great. And Joki, and then Claude.
Thanks, Thomas, for presenting and sharing with us today. I'll come on video, actually. There we go. Yeah, the possibility of a new tomorrow definitely is hopeful. And at the same time, I'm thinking about how, I was listening to this podcast where this artist's name is Bronte, and what they do with their program is ask people to donate guns, especially those in the US, and then they transform those guns into shovels, and then invite families that have been impacted by gun violence into ceremonies of growing trees in different cities. And Bronte was sharing how, this is giving the possibility of what else is possible for living together in peace. But also Bronte critiqued how people are drawn to the spectacular without investigating the consequences of what is actually happening. And so while I'm drawn to the possibility of a new tomorrow, I'm curious how this risks erasing the harm that has been done for us to be able to dream of a new tomorrow. And how do we talk about accountability, reconciliation, and reparations while building a new tomorrow?
Absolutely, very, very, very good point, Nyoki. It's to me the thing that happens with the pledge had happened to me, and I've seen it happen to others, is that by recognizing some of the mechanisms by which we reinforce our biases, the confirmation bias process, the way we deal with our cognitive dissonance, helps me to understand more, not only some of my actions in the past, but also other people's actions in the past. And that's one of the reasons why, as part of the pledge, I've included this notion that we pay attention to those mechanisms. So there's no point in repeating the mistakes of the past. Obviously, we need to learn as much as we possibly can from the past. Obviously, we need to acknowledge the challenges or the mistakes that were made, the injustices of the past. But we also need to make sure at the same time that we get to the cause of those things, so that it's not just good enough, as far as I'm concerned, to put a Band-Aid on something on an injury. I want to know what caused the injury. Why did we do this to each other? And what kind of thinking went into that, right? And how can we change the cultural dynamics that caused us to fall into those traps? And this is again why the cultural framework is so important, because if the cultural framework is one of hierarchy, right, that there are those that are good and those are not, that are unclean in some form, or those that are smart and those that are not, or those that are worthy and those that are not, if we have that kind of distinction, then we have the ability to abuse. And we do it, quite frankly, we do it with our sport. are team sports all the time. So we cheer on one team and we have disdain for another team based on what, right? We don't cheer all the teams simultaneously. We are so programmed to think in terms of us versus them that we, go crazy over the World Cup. And as long as our team wins, we're happy. If our team loses, we're not. And we have to trounce and beat and whatever each other, right? That's a cultural norm that's embedded in us. And if we do it in our sports, we're going to do it in our daily lives. And there's no need for that. We really need to move beyond that. We have a need on a global scale now to move beyond that and embrace each other as life forms right across the human scale, but also across all life forms on this planet, right? And in doing that, we can then get to the cause of the incredible violence and disparity and injustices that we have perpetrated in the past.
And Jogi, just want to see, does that, anything further on that just before I move?
Nothing at the moment, thank you.
Okay. Claude and then Indy.
Well, Thomas, you and I have been talking, I'm in my kitchen now, by the way, about this for a while. And my problem is that there isn't one culture. There is a dominant culture, and it's a capitalist culture, if you want. It's modernist and it's problematic in so many ways. So I appreciate that you're trying to shift our culture, but it's such a broad area that it would be useful to break it down and to say, I want to attack this piece or that piece. Like scale, we're trying to look at the role of the arts and how to re-author the world, that kind of the role of the arts that touch people's emotions. But it's very complex because it depends how people perceive art and how do you position art in modernism, how do you get out of modernism, so that's what I think it's great that you raise the issue. But there's so many generalizations. I mean, you're like raising a massive issue, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to try to contribute to at least one piece of that,
right.
Acknowledging that we do need a global shift. So I just want to thank you for putting yourself out there. And I was just talking with a colleague earlier today about failure, and I'm not saying you're failing, but inevitably when you stick your neck out and you raise issues, you hopefully won't be attacked, but you will be critiqued and you will get feedback and you will have raised important issues in people's minds. Like, I'm not a pledge kind of guy. I don't need that tool, but I know some people do, that it helps them to commit to something, to sign and so on. So that forward movement hopefully will help us all. And as you evolve and we all evolve in our thinking, I think we'll start finding niches where we really can make a difference and say, I really think I can address this particular issue, and combined we can change culture, but we can't change everything at once individually. We have to just find that piece where we can make a difference. Anyway, thanks for launching us in this conversation.
Well, can I build on that real quick, Claude? Because you're bang on. That's exactly the intent and the hope, right? That's the hopeful nature of this, is that what I want to do is raise the big issue, and like you and others, everybody will take a chunk of this and start applying a greater understanding of the importance of culture, and how can they nurture a different kind of thinking, a different kind of culture within this framework and in the community that they now work in or live in. And as everyone starts paying more attention to the role that culture does, we start removing the glass ceilings and the glass walls and the obstacles that are hidden to us to actually get things done in whatever area of expertise or area of activity you're engaged in. By having everyone understand the kind of cognitive biases that we all bring to these conversations, is really helpful. So, and then breaking it down into something that's a bite-sized area for each individual to work with is exactly what the outcome should be.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to, we might be following along, Thomas, but there are some comments as well in the in the chat from John and Taryn and Nishan. So we'll go to Indy first, but then maybe have you respond to some of those comments as well.
Thank you. Thank you for raising this as a question and for bringing it to the table. I think it's a very important question. I suppose kind of a little bit also building on what's been said, I think it's, so, I mean, I kind of ran through a mental exercise to say, well, actually, if we were to adopt this theory, if I was to adopt this theory, I would get rid of my pronoun and become we, they, them, because I recognize biologically I'm a multitude of organisms, right? Right. Actually, the idea of a kind of a singular pronoun is actually a kind of a Renaissance enlightened kind of objecthood, which doesn't actually operate in a kind of biophysical landscape. If I was to then extend that further, the theory of property, which is a theory of ownership and asymmetric kind of asymmetric ownership in a world which is fully entangled, becomes quite problematic. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the culture point is so important, but actually it goes so deep into the root of the system that actually we can say words. I mean, I suppose this is where I'm being, it's kind of nice to say no, us and them, but if we were to really take that to the end point, it's a very provocative position. And I suppose, which I think is really great, but I suppose why are we pushing that far? And it would go to the point that, you know, we should all be vegan, at least, in terms of actually kind of the kind of murder of life in an entangled world. Like there are all sorts of things come out when you sort of take this entangled world view into a different landscape. And how inconvenient is that truth, in a sense? And right, and in that inconvenience, why are we not positioning that inconvenient truth at the center of it, rather than sort of kind of nicely giving it philosophical landscapes and kind of nice words, rather than just really going to the root of the problem? And that entanglement is in space and time. So we're a function of our historic traumas, and we do carry them and we do impart them. So, like, I don't know, I suppose it's kind of, I find it like, this is kind of amongst friends, I find it almost like getting to the point of where it got interesting, yet not quite being provocative enough to kind of point the finger and kind of go, all right, then if we really want to talk about cultural transformation, it's going to have to be much deeper, and it's going to have to challenge all of our preconceptions and our relationship with the world in a much deeper sense. And at that moment in time, it becomes deeply interesting. And I think it's halfway house for me. If I'm really interesting, I want it to be so provocative to my own conception of self that it allows me to become fracturing. I think that's a great word, fracturing to my existing reality and embracing a new reality in a way. And I don't know, that's just like when I was reading the manifesto, thank you for sharing it. And I really respect you bringing it to debate, because I also think the culture stuff looks the easiest, but it's actually the hardest coded into the system, because it's a distributed code of norms and social lock-ins. And when you get to the end point, it gets really interesting. Anyway, so I genuinely appreciate being able to have this sort of conversation amongst us. So thank you very much.
Well, India, I would respond in two ways. One is go for it. You know, if you want to actually take it to a deeper level, you know, just like Claude says, everybody does their own thing with this starting point. And it is just a starting point. That's fantastic. You know, and at the same time, to me, the second point is that what's important is that we start having the conversation. We start recognizing the role that culture plays. We start challenging each other. How deep do you want to go into this? How far do you want to take this? How much do you want to embrace this inconvenient truth? Are you really willing to look at it? Right. And in so doing, starting to remove some of the obstacles again, you know, because I've seen so many good initiatives go to dead ends because they hit a cultural roadblock. And so being involved in this conversation is absolutely critical if we're going to create the kind of transition we need in time to save our ruddy little necks.
Stephen, and then just again drawing your attention to the chat. Good stuff happening there.
I'll let you, can I let you do that, Michelle, and maybe pick something out of the chat rather
Sure.
than me trying to read it?
Sure. Okay, Stephen, we'll go to
Great.
you.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Thomas, for the thought and commitment that you've brought to us today. I have signed the pledge. I read it, and I think what I think is attractive about this to me, or what I think what it touches on and is important, is that, as we can see from the reactions among the group today, is that it allows all of us to approach the issue of transformation from where we are and from what we're capable of and from what we're able to influence. But at the same time, I think invites us to consider not only the personal in the individual, but the contexts in which we operate and what we can bring into focus or into visibility as areas for influence. So I think we can think about what culture of opens up to, whether a culture of compassion and care, or a culture of justice, a culture of consumption and the rationalization of our economic inequalities in our own lives, a culture of conviviality and of mutual support, and so on. I think there's so many facets to this that, to go back to Indy's point, I think there's room for very provocative and challenging concepts to be shared, discussed, and brought into focus, so that people who are now, and I think this is increasingly more and more of us, are fully aware that we're passing through a time of tremendous disruption,
Yes.
upheaval, whether it's on food supply or, interstate conflict. It goes on and on and on and on. As someone said, it's the poly crisis that Thomas Homer Dixon and others have been talking about. So within that ambit, within that sphere, it's, I think, up to each of us and all of us to both express and be ready to take part in the shifts that are at hand, and to bring our own capacities to bear in supporting others going through this time of crisis. And so it's not clear what kind of culture we're going to have as a result of this, because so much is changing.
Yeah.
But to be just even conscious of this cultural shift, I think gets us to a starting point where we can elaborate what we want in an enduring culture, what constitutes an enduring culture. And it's not just one, of course, it's ecosystemic. And so there are multiple parts to this, but to avoid the culture of death that, the modern capitalist system seems to be imbued with and promoting, we have to make very conscious efforts. And I appreciate, Thomas, you're a farmer as well as somebody who talks about culture. And I think in that, I think there's something quite profound that, we're both nurturing the ground we stand on and the places where we find ourselves, while also engaging in provocations and conversations about what's happening and where we want to take things. So thank you again.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for those comments. It's the role of culture is such a dynamic thing, as you mentioned, but it also opens so many opportunities, right, to be aware of it. And one of them is to have more compassion for the people that sit around the table as we discuss the issues or the challenges or the opportunities that we want to embrace, right? And to me, that's one of the big things about this, is if we recognize the role of culture, the role that culture plays in influencing every person that we're engaging with, then we start to have an understanding that it's not a confrontational environment anymore. It's an environment that says, I understand my cognitive bias is based on my cultural norm, and I'm aware that you have them as you have your cognitive biases based on your cultural norm, and so does everyone else. Let's see how all this works and understand all that and bring some understanding, deeper understanding, compassion into the conversation. And that then creates in and of itself a new culture in the communities that we travel in.
So I'll just pause for a minute because I want to honor that we're past the 5 o'clock. So if you need to go, we want to wish you much peace and pause and ease over the holidays. We do often, for those who are new, sometimes go into an extra 15 minutes or so because these things don't always just naturally transition from this moment. So I want to thank Thomas for taking us into the holidays with something that is thought-provoking, but a call for hope and for us to be centering culture as we go into the new year. And I will draw our attention for those who are staying. I don't know, John, if you want to share your question or if you want me to share it, but
well, I'm more than happy to address it. I totally support all the conversations going on. I guess my concern is it feels a little bit narrow, kind of like Thomas referenced in terms of the 100 activists that show up versus the 12.99 million who don't show up. And that I do believe some people are better at becoming enlightened about the problems and finding ways to become better people. My concern really is the scale of the mass of the population. And certainly Martin Luther King kind of made reference to this, and he said that he feared more than the Ku Klux Klan was the middle white mass, because it's the middle white mass that defines the culture, clogs the ballot box with inertia, and nothing changes. And here we are, pardon my ignorance for when Martin Luther King died, but 50 plus years later, we haven't solved that.
Right.
So it's not from a lack of desire, it's causing scale. So that's, and you know, we're all very much aware, I think, of what the problems are in the world. And I think we need to evolve from complaining and making aware of the issues to solving them. So my question then is, how do we solve for this? How do we deal with Martin Luther King's focus and concern with the middle white mass? Unless we get to scale with culture, then it won't fundamentally change those things.
Yeah, good point, John. And I think MLK was bang on with that. That's still the problem that we have today. The interesting thing is that our culture is, yes, it helps us, it causes us to be entrenched in our thinking, and yes, it can cause us to stay in the quagmire of the status quo. But it is also much more able to adapt to change than, for example, our genes are, or even our family rituals, right? So the changes that have taken place since MLK made that statement have been driven through cultural action, through cultural activity, right? And it is the governing bodies that have heard that cultural change and have then adapted our laws and our rules and our regulations to align themselves with that change. And so I think that it's important to remember that we need to pay attention to the culture first, and give the legislators that we elect the cover to actually move with us into a new way of seeing the world. And there is where I get inspiration from people like Simon Sinek and Seth Godin, and talking about the tipping point. We don't need to get everybody, but we do need to build momentum around an understanding that this cultural shift, this cultural awareness that Stephen talked about, needs to grow and become more prevalent all the time. And that's one of the reasons I put the pledge together, because I felt that might be a vehicle to do that. There may be other vehicles, there may be other ways of doing this. I don't know. This is just, it's in early stages, but moving the masses into a new way of embracing life on Earth is critical if we're going to survive the 21st century.
Yeah, you know, we've discussed this too, Thomas, at length. You know, I come at this from a different perspective, in that I believe if we really want to solve cultural problems of gender inequality and racism, et cetera, it's more powerful to do it through systemic change, through policy. certain nations around the world have mandated certain requirements for women, equal pay, for example. When you start to put this into policy, you then bring it into the mainstream, maybe with many people kicking and screaming or trying to give rationale to why it's a bad policy. But ultimately, if you want to solve problems, I don't know if culturally we could have or have solved much about racism and gender inequality, whereas the nations that seem to have made better progress, I'll include homelessness as well. There are jurisdictions, there are some US states that don't have homelessness because they changed their policies. And so I just put that on the table, that I think if we want to start focusing on solutions, how we're truly going to get to a better place, I would suggest that it's more than culture, that it requires policy and systemic change to mandate it.
And Claude on his closing, culture is life, life is culture. So love the, how we're able to hold these moments together. Maybe just in the interest of, like, for those who can stay, maybe a closing word because I know, Thomas, you've inspired something here. And as we kind of go into the holidays, if you have to hop off, no worry, but I'm just going to come around and check in for a word as we leave one another. Stephen, if I can start with you. Oh, you had to scoot, so must have put, okay. So I'll start with Lynn and then Danny.
Pondering.
Thoughtful.
John and then Nishan.
I don't think I have anything more to add other than to say I appreciate everybody's participation in these things and the opportunity to step back and to Thomas's point to think, to be cognitive about all these issues. So I just wish everybody a happy holidays and thank you for including me in these discussions.
Thank you. Nishan and Maggie.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. Taryn's comment about moral absolutism got me thinking about Kantian ethics and Enlightenment rationalism, which is probably something that I'll touch upon with the RSA Canada stuff. So yeah, I'll just leave those topic headings there.
Thank you. Maggie and then Taryn.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this. And I truly appreciate the debate that's been started here. It's lots of great things happening in my mind. And I look forward to seeing more debates as vigorous as this in the new year. All the best to all of you. Thank you.
Great. Taryn and then Graham.
I am so sorry. I was capturing notes. I'm not sure what you're asking of me.
Just a closing word as we leave. No worries.
No worries. Awesome. Yeah. Once again, thank you, Thomas, and everyone else. It was a really engaging discussion. I think that one of the big things that has really come out of this is just the acknowledgement of the need to think about how we think and how we go about the way that we do things. So I just really appreciate the time and space of everyone. So thank you.
Great. Graham and then Njoki.
Thanks, Michelle. Hello and goodbye. It's great to see you all. Thanks for the notes, but I was not able, as I mentioned in my chat, but the role of faith communities in this subject, I think, is a significant one. We're trying to play our part in that space, and I'm just going to look forward to reading and listening to more of what you had there, Thomas. So listening is my word, and also wishing everybody a wonderful rest. Looking forward to 2023.
Njoki and Victor.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the discussion. Thank you, Thomas, for taking the time to share that. For me at this moment, I'm feeling a sense of urgent slowness. Paradox, it is what it is.
Great, thank you, Njoki. Victor and then Indy.
Yeah, just deep gratitude for your leadership, Michelle. Always grateful to be in brilliant rooms with Graham, with Tim, with Njoki, with Indy. Indy always inspires me. I try and like every tweet Indy tweets I follow. So just being in a space of like mind, like values, and working on tackling some of these pervasive challenges, to me, is always inspiring. So I give thanks to all of you. And Lynn, congratulations on the retirements.
Yeah, I think I think I'm not speaking maybe, I think it's transition. So more to come.
Then so we'll connect, Lynn.
Awesome. Cool. Love it. Indy.
Just absolute gratitude and thanks to the room and to Thomas for actually putting this out there, because I think we need your braveness to put this out there, to hold these sort of conversations as well. And I really appreciate everyone holding the space. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And Thomas.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here and for participating in this, inconvenient truth, as somebody said. I'm very humbled by the response and all the thoughtful comments. And I'm very open to having more conversations. You all have my contact information if you want to explore any ideas or have any suggestions as to how we can move this concept forward. Please reach out. I'm always available.
Great. Thank you. And my word is possibility. And so, yeah, much gratitude for each of you for bringing your wonderful minds and just leading into these moments together. And I will follow up with everybody who has made a presentation just to find out what kind of sparks have come from those connections. And as always, I know there's a few folks who would like to have some side nodes or groups to do a few action oriented moments together, and so we'll share those out in the new year as well. So thank you, everybody. And just a note, if you came on late, we did have to shift the session with Cassie Robinson to January 24th, so that will be out of your calendar for tomorrow. And we look forward to January 11th with Nishan, and January 24th with Cassie, and then we also have Youth Climate Corp coming that week as well. So much peace to each of you, and I'll hang around in case you have any other thoughts or comments. And thanks, Taryn, for capturing once again. And if you want to do a switcheroo in January, just send me a note. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you.